In 1995, a school bus carrying 5 young children, their dedicated teacher, and their beloved driver vanished without a trace from a quiet Detroit street. In the gaping void left by their disappearance, law enforcement hastily constructed a simple yet inhumane version of events. The driver, an African-American man named Isaac Davenport, allegedly lost his mind, abducted his passengers, and fled. For 29 long years, this lie remained the sole official story. It was a tale of betrayal that tarnished an entire family's reputation and concealed a shocking reality. However, the true story lay in deep oblivion, sealed by the rust of time and an all-consuming silence, awaiting only the right circumstances to resurface. For Isaac Davenport, an autumn Tuesday in 1995 was supposed to be just another ordinary day. At 42, he was an integral part of his Detroit neighborhood. He was the reliable driver of bus number 12 for North Star Academy, a small charter school located in a predominantly African-American working-class district. His gentle smile and steady hand were a source of calm and reassurance for 2 generations of schoolchildren. For Isaac, it wasn't just a job. It was a true calling. He understood each child not by their home address, but by their secret dreams, hidden fears, and the superheroes they diligently drew in their notebooks. He was far more than just a driver. He was a confidant, a protector, a familiar anchor in their daily lives. His 14-year-old daughter, Kenya, deeply revered him. She saw unwavering dignity in the way he meticulously polished his bus mirrors every morning. She felt the pride he took in his work, often underestimated by many. He was her hero, a man whose integrity was as unyielding as the Michigan steel their city was built from. She knew he was on his last special run of the day. The late bus was taking a small group of students home after an advanced arts and sciences after-school program. Aboard bus number 12, that fateful day, were 5 children whose minds still sparkled with fresh creative ideas. Among them was 9-year-old Omar Bakari, a cheerful and restless boy with a sketchbook always at hand. Accompanying them was Ms. Valerie Sinclair, a dedicated and sensitive mentor in her 30s, known for her boundless devotion to her students. The route was simple, a winding road through quiet residential streets that Isaac knew by heart, like the back of his hand. The bus was last captured by a traffic camera at 4:15 p.m., making a routine right turn onto a side street lined with old maple trees. It was an utterly unremarkable moment. The yellow school bus disappeared around the bend on a quiet autumn afternoon, never to be seen again. By 5 p.m., with the bus half an hour late for its first scheduled drop-off, the school began its initial attempts to make contact. By 5:30 p.m., the first anxious and bewildered parents, including Omar Bakari's, were already calling each other, an icy knot of dread tightening in their hearts. By 6 p.m., the Detroit Police Department had been notified. For Kenya Davenport, the nightmare began with a call from Omar's mother to her home. "Kenya, is your dad home yet?" He never dropped Omar off. Kenya's mother had passed away years earlier, leaving an unbreakable bond between father and daughter. She knew her father's schedule down to the last detail. He never, ever allowed himself to be late without warning. An icy wave of panic washed over her. She called his pager. No response. She called his dispatch radio. The line, usually crackling with chatter, now met her with an ominous silence. By nightfall, the full terrifying reality became clear. A school bus with 5 children and 2 adults had literally vanished into thin air. The initial police response was a mix of bewilderment and strict adherence to protocol. Patrol cars began methodically sweeping the route, their searchlights piercing the empty streets and quiet homes with sterile beams. But absolutely nothing was found. No crash site, no broken glass, no skid marks, no signs of struggle. The bus, a massive, conspicuous yellow vehicle, had simply seemed to evaporate into the urban landscape. Kenya and the families of the other missing children, along with Ms. Sinclair, gathered at North Star Academy. The school's brightly lit gymnasium became a temporary headquarters, filled with grief and fear. Parents clutched photos of their children, their faces pale and distorted by disbelief. Kenya held a picture of her father, a proud man standing beside his bus, his arm protectively around her shoulder years ago. Hours dragged by agonizingly slowly, bringing no news. Police took statements, their questions seeming meaningless and utterly irrelevant in the face of such an impossible event. How could a school bus, a 40-foot vessel of bright yellow steel, simply disappear? The question hung in the air, testifying to a mystery that seemed less like a crime and more like a tear in the very fabric of existence. For Kenya, the night was a hazy blur of hushed, panicked whispers, holding hands with other crying children, staring at her father's photo, and stubbornly refusing to accept the unthinkable. Her hero, the most loyal and dependable man she knew, was gone. As the first long night of their shared nightmare began, she had no idea that the official version of the truth presented by the city would soon become a separate, even more insidious form of violence. A lie that would haunt her family and dishonor her father's good name for the next 29 years. The disappearance of North Star Academy's bus number 12 should have catalyzed one of the largest and most urgent search operations in Detroit's history. A school bus, a teacher, and a group of children had vanished. The premise itself was so monstrous, so fundamentally wrong, that it seemed to demand a comprehensive response. For the first 48 hours, it appeared it would. The story was central to every local news broadcast. The mayor held a grim press conference, and police officials assured the public that all possible resources were being deployed. But for the families, and especially for 14-year-old Kenya Davenport, the gaping chasm between the loud public pronouncements and the harsh private reality of the investigation quickly became apparent. The search was extensive but lacked clear direction. Without a last known location beyond that final turn, and with no ransom demand to provide a clue, the police were chasing a phantom. The investigation, led by a pair of jaded and cynical homicide detectives, began to deviate from its initial course, seeking a simple explanation for an incredibly complex incident. They found it in Isaac Davenport. For the investigators, an African-American man from a working-class neighborhood, caught in the center of a mysterious crime, was seen not as a victim, but as a convenient variable in the equation. The narrative began to shift, not with a sudden accusation, but with a slow, poisonous stream of hints and innuendo. Isaac, the beloved driver, was reimagined in a new, sinister light. He had minor financial difficulties. They discovered he had argued with a dispatcher a month earlier over a schedule change. He was a single father. These most mundane details of his daily life were meticulously gathered and distorted beyond recognition, transforming into an ominous portrait of a man under immense pressure, ready to snap at any moment. Kenya and her grandmother endured hours of questioning that felt more like an interrogation than an objective investigation. Did your father ever seem angry, Kenya, or depressed? Did he ever talk about wanting to get away from it all? The questions were steeped in hidden subtext, designed to paint a picture of a man on the verge of a breakdown, capable of an uncontrolled act. My father loved his job, Kenya insisted, her voice trembling with a mix of deep grief and teenage fury. He loved those children. He would never hurt anyone. But her words, the words of a distraught child, were dismissed as naive, childish loyalty. The families of the missing students, initially united by shared horror, began receiving quiet, unofficial hints from the detectives. We're looking into the driver's background. There might be more to this story than meets the eye. Once planted, the seed of suspicion began to relentlessly sprout, shattering the fragile unity of grief that had gripped the community. It was far easier for the city to accept the idea of a troubled man abducting the bus than to confront the terrifying alternative. That a professional, organized, and ruthless force could operate with such flawless precision in their city, making a 40-foot bus and its occupants vanish without a trace. Blaming the victim proved much simpler. It allowed them to contain the escalating terror. The official search for the bus was formally called off after just 2 weeks. The story disappeared from newspaper front pages. At a final press conference on the case, The police department announced that while the search for the children continued, the primary focus of their investigation had fundamentally shifted. Isaac Davenport was no longer considered missing. He was now officially named the sole suspect in the abduction of the teacher and children, a fugitive from justice. This announcement was a public execution of his reputation. His smiling face on missing person posters was replaced by a grim, mugshot-like photo in the news. The caption beneath it read, "Isaac Davenport wanted." For Kenya, this was a second, far deeper disappearance. First, she lost her father. Now, the world stripped him of his good name, replacing the hero she knew and loved with a monster of their own making. Her family was irrevocably shattered. The community's earlier sympathy now turned to deep suspicion. She was no longer seen as the daughter of a beloved, missing man. From then on, she was the daughter of a fugitive abductor. The weight of this lie proved unbearable. Kenya found herself completely isolated. Her grief was compounded by a burning, helpless rage. The case of the Phantom School bus gradually faded. However, the official version was etched in stone, becoming a convenient fiction the city could readily believe. For 29 years, Kenya Davenport carried a double burden: the loss of her father and a stolen legacy. Her fight for his exoneration was a solitary, silent war. The years following Isaac Davenport's official declaration as a fugitive became a long, slow fading of hope for his daughter, Kenya. The world seemed to readily accept the police department's neat narrative. Isaac was portrayed as a villain, a man who had snapped, a boogeyman used to scare new bus drivers. The children and Ms. Sinclair were his tragic, silent victims. Their faces gradually disappeared from public memory, their cases effectively closed, swallowed by the larger, more convenient file of their alleged abductor. Kenya grew up fast. At 14, she had to defend her father's character to neighbors who now averted their gaze, avoiding her eyes. At 16, she spent nights in the library, not studying for school, but reading legal books, trying to understand how the system could so thoroughly and heartlessly erase a good man from history. All this blatant injustice shaped her into the woman she became: sharp, relentless, and deeply distrustful of any authority. She didn't choose a career in law, as the courtroom seemed to her a place of performance, not truth. Instead, she became a paralegal at a small, tenacious firm specializing in wrongful conviction cases. It was a choice born from her own family's tragedy. She spent her days poring over case files, searching for inconsistencies, that single thread which, if pulled, could unravel the official lie. Every case she worked on was an indirect battle, a fight for the justice denied to her own father. Her personal life was one of quiet solitude. The trauma of 1995 left her weary, cautious. She maintained a small circle of trusted friends who knew her story and respected her ongoing, silent struggle. She never married, never had children. How could she? When the world had shown her how easily a family could be torn apart, how quickly a loved one could not just be lost, but also slandered. For 29 years, her father's case was her constant shadow. She wrote letters to successive police chiefs, mayors, and investigative journalists, pleading with them to re-examine the evidence. Most of her appeals went unanswered. The few replies were boilerplate letters, polite rejections citing a lack of new evidence. The case was closed. Isaac Davenport was a fugitive. That was the end of the story. But for Kenya, it was never the end. She became an amateur archivist of the tragedy. On a secure hard drive, she kept digitized copies of every news article, police statement, and photograph. She tracked the original detectives, noting their retirements. She observed the slow, sad unraveling of the other families, the divorces, the moves, the quiet resignation to a grief that had no resolution. The suspicion cast on her father was a poison, preventing the families from uniting in a common cause. By 2024, Kenya Davenport was 43 years old. She was a respected paralegal, a woman known for her sharp mind and tireless work ethic. To colleagues, she was a private, dedicated professional. Few knew the ghost that drove her. The hope of finding her father alive had long faded. What remained was a single, unwavering goal: to clear her father's name. She had resigned herself to likely fighting this battle until her grave. The system had built its wall of lies too high, too thick. She had no idea that just a few miles away, in the industrial outskirts of her own city, a veteran crane operator was about to lift a rusted, forgotten piece of the past into the sky, and in doing so, provide the single explosive new piece of evidence she had waited her entire adult life for. The Detroit United Scrapyard was a sprawling metallic graveyard where the city's spent history came to die. Mountains of rusted cars, twisted rebar, and forgotten industrial machinery baked under the autumn sun, awaiting their turn to be fed into the maw of the crusher. A massive hydraulic press could flatten a sedan into a pancake in less than a minute. For Scrap Johnson, a man in his 50s who had operated the yard's main crane for longer than he could remember, it was just another Tuesday. His job was a rhythm of noise and force. The rumble of the crane engine, the satisfying clang of the massive electromagnet latching onto a vehicle, the final shuddering crunch of the press. He worked with practiced, almost bored efficiency. That day, his next target was a pathetic old school bus, hauled on a flatbed from a recently cleared, long-abandoned industrial site on the city's outskirts. It was a ghost from another era. Its iconic yellow paint had faded to a sickly ochre, caked with rust and grime. Its windows were shattered, its tires long rotted away. It was just another piece of junk, number 73 on his daily list. Scrap maneuvered the crane. The powerful electromagnet descended and, with a deafening clang, secured itself to the bus's roof. He lifted it effortlessly, the rusted hulk swaying gently in the air as he moved it towards the crusher platform. He was on autopilot, his thoughts already on his lunch break. He positioned the bus over the platform, released the magnet, and watched it settle into place with a heavy, final thud. He retreated to the crane's control cabin, his hand reaching for the large red button that would begin the crushing process. He pressed the button. The hydraulic arms of the massive press began their slow, inexorable descent. It was at that moment, as the shadow of the descending plate fell across the bus, that something caught his eye. A piece of rusted paneling on the side of the bus, loosened by the rough handling, had fallen away, revealing a small, protected section of the inner wall that had been shielded from the elements for decades. On that small patch of faded yellow, something was taped. It was a child's drawing. A simple crayon sketch of a bright yellow sun with a smiling face. Such art adorned millions of classroom walls. Scrap, his hand frozen over the controls, squinted. A child's drawing on a school bus. Well, common enough. But this bus, it seemed different. It was old. It had been hidden somewhere for a very, very long time. There's a story here, he thought, a sad story. He thought of his own grandchildren, their drawings taped to his refrigerator. A sudden, inexplicable instinct, a gut feeling honed by decades of observing the discarded remnants of human lives, screamed at him. His hand shot out and slammed the massive red emergency stop button. With a loud hiss of hydraulic pressure, the crusher plate halted inches from the bus's roof. The sudden silence was deafening. Scrap climbed down from his control cabin, his heart beating a little faster than usual. He walked over to the bus, peering through a broken window at the drawing. It was a simple sun, but in that moment, it felt like a message, a small, defiant flicker of life in a tomb of rust. He knew the protocol. Unidentified vehicles, especially those that seemed out of place, were supposed to be checked. This one had arrived as part of a large batch. It was likely unregistered, destined for the dump without a second thought. But this drawing, it was wrong. Acting on an intuition he couldn't fully explain, he returned to his cabin, grabbed his radio, and called his yard manager. "Boss," he said, his voice raspy, "you better get down here. This old school bus we're about to crush, something's not right about it. I think maybe we should call someone before this thing disappears forever." The yard manager, initially annoyed by the delay, came down to look. He saw the drawing, saw the look on Scrap's face, and agreed. It was probably nothing, but in a city like Detroit, a city full of ghosts and forgotten stories, you never knew. An hour later, a lone Detroit Police Department patrol car, responding to a non-emergency call about a suspicious abandoned vehicle, pulled into the scrapyard. Its arrival was the first quiet step towards reopening a 29-year-old wound and uncovering a crime the city had long tried to forget. The initial police response to the call from Detroit United Scrapyard was lukewarm. An abandoned bus was hardly a priority. But when the first responding officers ran the barely legible vehicle identification number, a flag that had lain dormant for nearly 3 decades sprang to life on their in-car computer system. The bus was officially listed as evidence in a major unsolved case from 1995, the disappearance of North Star Academy bus number 12. The call went up the chain of command, and within hours, the scrapyard was transformed. The rhythmic clang of metal gave way to the quiet, focused intensity of a major crime scene investigation. Detective Ben Lawson of the Detroit PD's cold case unit arrived, his mind racing. He was a sharp, modern detective in his 40s, and he knew the legend of the Phantom Bus, a case so old it was practically a myth. His first call was to a number he found deep in an old digital file, a number that had been dialed countless times in the 90s with no new information. It belonged to Kenya Davenport. When Detective Lawson informed her of the discovery of her father's bus, a long, ragged silence hung on the other end of the line, broken only by a single, barely audible question. Where exactly? At the scrapyard, Detective Lawson and his forensic team, with Kenya observing from a distance with a victim's advocate, began the meticulous and painstaking process of examining the rusted hulk. The bus presented itself as a peculiar time capsule, sealed by decades of neglect and decay. They meticulously documented every detail, from the child's drawing of the son that Scrap Johnson had noticed to the layers of rust and decomposition. The initial inspection of the main cabin was both poignant and puzzling. They found remnants of interrupted lives, a small discarded hair ribbon, a faded comic book half buried in debris, a petrified sandwich remnant in a brown paper bag. However, there were no human remains. The children were not there. This discovery brought a new wave of agony. If they weren't in the bus, where were they? But the forensic team noticed something odd. The floor of the bus in the rear section was inconsistent. A patch of sturdy rubber flooring looked different from the rest, as if it was either newer or had experienced different wear. Beneath it, the metal floor showed clear signs of having been cut and then re-welded. It was a crude yet effective modification, virtually undetectable beneath years of grime. Detective Lawson ordered a section of the floor to be carefully cut out. As a powerful saw whirred through the metal, a new, unsettling space was revealed beneath. It was a hidden, shallow compartment, no more than 2 feet deep, extending across the entire width of the bus. It had been expertly welded shut. The team used heavy tools to pry open the sealed metal plate. A wave of cold, stale air rushed out. The contents were wrapped in thick, oil-soaked tarpaulins. A forensic technician, grim-faced, carefully peeled back the first layer. The silence in the scrapyard was absolute. Inside were the remains of 2 adults. One, a man, showed signs of struggle and trauma consistent with a violent event. His work uniform, though decayed, was identified as that of a city bus driver. The other, a woman, had apparently met the same tragic fate. They had been hidden here, in this secret, welded compartment, for 29 years. Later, dental records confirmed what everyone already suspected. The remains belonged to Isaac Davenport, the bus driver, and Ms. Valerie Sinclair, the accompanying teacher. This discovery was a profound, seismic shift in the case. Isaac Davenport was not a fugitive abductor. He was a hero, a primary victim who had clearly fought his captors and been killed for his resistance. Ms. Sinclair had died with him, likely in an attempt to protect her students. Kenya Davenport, watching from a distance, finally let out a sob she had held back for long hours. It was the sound of deep grief for her father's tragic end, and simultaneously, a fierce, vindicating love. His name was finally, undeniably cleared. But the relief was immediately overshadowed by a new, even more sinister mystery. The children, including 9-year-old Omar Bakari, were not in the hidden compartment. They were not in the bus at all. The perpetrators had killed the 2 adults who could have protected the children, and then taken the 5 students to an unknown location. The mystery had just grown significantly larger and far more ominous. The discovery that Isaac Davenport and Valerie Sinclair had been killed, their remains hidden in the very bus they were last seen in, transformed a 29-year-old mystery into a high-priority double homicide investigation. Isaac, long the accused villain, was now officially recognized as the primary victim, a hero who died trying to protect his charges. For his daughter, Kenya, this public exoneration was a profound, pivotal relief, the first ray of light in a life previously shrouded in shadow. But it was immediately overshadowed by a darker, more complex question. If her father was a victim, what happened to the children? And why would anyone go to such elaborate lengths to hijack a school bus? Detective Ben Lawson, with Kenya Davenport now serving as an official consultant on the investigation, began to view the case not as a simple abduction, but as part of a much larger, more intricate criminal puzzle. They focused on the anomalies found in the bus, chemical traces discovered at the scene, a shell casing, and the expertly executed welding of the hidden compartment. These were not the signs of a lone, deranged abductor. This was the work of professionals. Kenya, using her paralegal skills, delved into the depths of the city's 1995 archives, searching for other major unsolved crimes that occurred within the same narrow time window as the bus disappearance. She cross-referenced old police reports, newspaper articles, and court documents. And then she found it, a story that had dominated headlines for weeks in late 1995 before also fading. The audacious robbery of a Federal Reserve armored car, which had netted millions of dollars. The details of the heist were legendary. A professional gang had ambushed the armored truck on a city overpass. The crime was meticulously planned, but it was the getaway that had baffled investigators for decades. Witnesses reported seeing well-equipped robbers transferring cash into a waiting vehicle, but descriptions were fragmented and contradictory. One unusual, previously dismissed witness statement mentioned seeing them transfer bags into what looked like a beat-up yellow school bus that had pulled up to the scene with incredible timing. At the time, police had dismissed it as absurd. A school bus as a getaway vehicle? It was too conspicuous, too illogical. Suddenly, that very notion made logical sense. Detective Lawson's team re-examined the evidence from the bus in a new light. The chemical traces found on the floor matched the residue of dye packs used in bank money bags. The large-caliber shell casing matched the type of ammunition used by one of the known suspects in the robbery, a man who had been questioned but never charged. The phantom bus from the robbery and Isaac Davenport's missing bus number 12 were one and the same. The new theory was chillingly clear. A known gang of professional thieves had planned the heist of the century and needed the perfect, inconspicuous getaway vehicle. They hijacked Isaac Davenport's bus, an easy target on a quiet route. They killed Isaac and Ms. Sinclair to eliminate witnesses and gain control of the vehicle. Then, they used the bus, a symbol of childhood innocence, as a Trojan horse to transport their stolen millions, driving away from the robbery scene undetected in a vehicle no one would ever suspect. The investigation now had names, faces from the old robbery case. They were professional criminals, now elderly men in their 70s, living quiet lives on the proceeds they had stolen 3 decades ago. Detective Lawson's team began building a new case, connecting the old robbery to the fresh evidence of the homicides. They tracked down the surviving members of the gang. The culmination was the arrest of the elderly gang leader, a man who had lived in quiet luxury, his great crime a source of local legend but never proven. Faced with the new forensic links from the bus, and a renewed investigation, and perhaps the confession of a less hardened member of his old crew, the wall of silence finally crumbled. He confessed to the robbery, to the hijacking, and to his involvement in the deaths of Isaac and Valerie. But when Detective Lawson and Kenya asked him the most painful question, "What did you do with the 5 children?" the old man's face was a mask of cold indifference. Leverage, he rasped back. We took them with us after the job, just for a while, to make sure no one followed too close. Dropped them off a day later, out of state on a quiet road. Gave them some money. Told them to walk to the nearest town. What happened to them after that? Not my problem. They were just loose ends. The confession was the final, crushing blow. The children were not the target. They were disposable tools, a kind of living shield in a robbery, then abandoned hundreds of miles from home. Their ultimate fates remained unknown. A new, tragic mystery emerging from the resolution of an old one. The surviving members of the robbery gang were convicted for their involvement in the deaths of Isaac Davenport and Valerie Sinclair. Their life sentences offered little solace against a lifetime of pain. Isaac's name was publicly and heroically vindicated. A memorial was erected at the new North Star Academy in his and Ms. Sinclair's honor. Kenya Davenport stood at the memorial's dedication. Her long fight to clear her father's name was finally over. She had cleared his name, seen those responsible for his death brought to justice. But the victory felt hollow and incomplete. The story of the children, Omar Bakari and the others, remained unfinished. They were still out there somewhere, their fates unknown, their families still waiting. The story ends with Kenya, having won the battle for her father, silently beginning a new, even more challenging one, dedicating her entire life and available resources to finding the 5 missing children of bus number 12.